Hey guys, I have major plans for these tools and I have a whole lot more. But why are they in the video? I'll keep you guessing for now. Okay, so in the last video, I said there are 10 things that I think we need to challenge, 10 assumptions that we need to challenge about preaching, but I only got through 5. I want to quickly finish up the other 5 so we can move on. Okay, so what are they? The first one, well, okay, that would be the 6th one, I guess. I'm going to call it sacralizing. What I mean is this attempt by many to argue for a sacred hermeneutic, in other words, a special way for interpreting the Bible. And that seems nuts on many levels, not least of which is that the whole point of the Bible is to say that this is God speaking to humanity in a way that humanity can relate to. And then along come Christians with sacred hermeneutics, and they basically are saying, no. While we believe that theologically, when it comes to actual interpretation, we think we need all kinds of special procedures to interpret the Bible. And that is weird. It's weird on many levels, one of which is it often ends up reversing the directionality of the Bible. Let me give you an example. The New Testament often talks about Jesus in terminology that in the Old Testament applies to Israel, okay? So in the Old Testament, in Isaiah, for instance, especially in the later parts of Isaiah, Israel is usually or often called the servant of the Lord. The idea is that Israel as a people is God's servant in this world that is supposed to live in a way that reflects God to the world, okay? Servant of the Lord. It's very clear in Isaiah that it refers to Israel. So then Jesus uses that language and talks about himself. He's basically saying, I am taking on the role of Israel because Israel hasn't been doing so great. Therefore, it makes sense that I apply that language to myself. What do Christians typically do with a passage like that? They're basically saying that text back there was really not about Israel. It was about Jesus. It is prophecy. Well, way to go if you want to rip the Old Testament away from the people for whom it was actually written, which was Israel. That's not what Jesus is doing. What Jesus is doing is he's pointing back to Israel. He's basically saying, interpret my actions against the background of Israel centuries ago or through the centuries. And you should be able to understand that what I'm doing here is I'm living out the mission and the vision that Israel was supposed to live out, but didn't. So if you want to use an arrow here, metaphorically, the arrow goes from Jesus back to the Old Testament. He basically says to people, if you want to interpret me well, you need to find the clue in the Old Testament. What Christians often do is they reverse the direction of the arrow. Now it's from the Old Testament pointing forward by way of prophecy. And you'd have to ask yourself, then what would have been the point of the book of Isaiah for the Israelites at the time? Just to say, you know what? Here's a prophecy of something that's going to happen much later. It's got nothing to do with you. Enjoy. That's silly. Now I know that people are going to say, but doesn't Matthew's gospel keep saying things like Jesus said this or he did this in order to fulfill that? Doesn't that mean prophecy? Well, not in that sense. What it means is he's actually fulfilling the things that Israel was supposed to do, but didn't do. So in other words, it makes complete sense to see the arrow as pointing back to the Old Testament, as saying that's where you find the clue as to what I'm about, rather than to make it point from the Old Testament forward and simply say, it's prophecy, cool. And by the way, if it were prophecy, then what would be the point of it? Just to say, look, God can do these tricks, God can prophesy? Great, is that it? But what I suggested to you is that there are much more powerful ways of interpreting that also happen to be much more likely. So please, let's get rid of this sacred hermeneutic notion, this notion of a special kind of interpretation, that only the few are entitled to somehow do when it suits them, and so on. It is silly on many fronts. But one of the worst parts of it is that it actually destroys the text that supposedly is so important. Let's get rid of it. Number 7, I want to call individualizing. Is that a word? I don't know. It doesn't matter. It is now. Individualizing. What I mean by that is we always want to give this appearance at church of being ever so practical, of being relevant and so on. And so we individualize the heck out of the text. And we talk to people as if the text were about individuals. But here's the thing. If you go, for instance, to Ephesians, especially in the second half of Ephesians, chapters 4, 5, 6, there's a lot of practical stuff and there's a lot of ethical stuff. There's a lot of do this, don't do that. Now, it's easy to individualize that and to say, in a sermon, listen, people, you can't do this, but you should do that, and so on. The problem is, if we do that, we're simply not taking the text seriously. I'm saying it because every one of those, we call them ethical imperatives, the do this, don't do that. Every one of those ethical imperatives makes better sense and sometimes only makes sense if it actually applies to a communal setting rather than to some individual. Okay, so for instance, if it says, if you believe in God, don't lie, the community gets damaged by it. If it were just an individual on his or her own lying, the damage would be minimal. Same with stealing. What's the problem with stealing? Of course, there's an ethical problem as such to do with selfishness and so on. But the biggest problem about stealing is, of course, it damages the person you're stealing from. So it's about community. It's not about individual. And yet we often take those ethical passages, those ethical imperatives, and we rip them out of their communal setting, and we just individualize it and say to people, okay, this is how you perform, or this is how you do things in life, and this is how you don't do it. That's super reductionistic. We're losing most of the impetus of the biblical text right there. Number 8 is, I want to call it spiritualizing. We have a habit in churches to claim, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, that whatever happens there is somehow spiritual. We're so into it, we do so much of that it practically removes any notion of being critical. Now, am I arguing that people should go to church to be critical? Of course not. I'm just arguing for some kind of communal balance, and we don't have that. We have one-way traffic, and you're not supposed to question what happens at the front. So what ends up really happening at the end of the day is very often when people say, oh, the Spirit said this and the Spirit did that, what it often means, it's not much more than, ooh, I really like that today. That's not good enough. We can't just be narcissistic in our view of what happened at church and just call it spiritual for that reason. It's a shallow notion. It's narcissistic. It completely bypasses the very thing that I was talking about in the previous point, which was 7, I think, about being communal. The Spirit is the New Testament's way of talking about Jesus being present in the midst of the community. But we don't have much by way of communities, do we? So ultimately, then we feel free to move the role of the Spirit kind of sideways, and we appeal to the Spirit as a way of essentially saying, ooh, I really like this, without saying, ooh, I really like this. Number 9, I want to call applicizing. Now, that is definitely not a word. The assumption that people often make in theology is that somehow timeless truth is a good thing. We're supposed to look for timeless truth. Now, that's a very questionable assumption, and I'll tell you why I think so in a minute. But then the second part to it would be to say, all right, once we have this sort of timelessly true meaning, we can translate that meaning in practical terms, in terms that people can relate to, and now they know how they need to live. Okay, let's look at the first one, timelessly true. That is actually a contradiction in term. Truth, any notion of truth that is not connected to time and space, how we live, where we live, is irrelevant. It's completely abstract, and that is the biggest problem with the term timeless. It actually is not available for application. One, there's no such thing as timeless truth, because truth has to be contextual in order to actually connect with real life. And 2, truth is not meant to be encapsulated in some kind of principle that then somehow releases you to apply it almost any way you see fit. It's just not good enough. I talked about this in another video. I'm going to link it. I called it principlizing. What I did now is just added that application idea. If this were legitimate, we could literally just go to the text and chop it up and squeeze something out of it and say, here's timeless truth. And then we turn to, the congregation and we say, let's apply it. And then people think the Spirit has spoken. We've just slaughtered the text, any reasonable notion of truth. And we've basically taken control of the whole process while still claiming that somehow, this is a divine thing because we took it initially from the Bible. So should we be surprised that there are so many Christians of a fundamentalist nature, the kind that also sign up for QAnon? So you have kind of Christendom identity and you have QAnon faith. We shouldn't be surprised. We've signed up for a system where the many listen to the few, the one very often, and if the one is a fundamentalist, the many are in trouble. And the way this works is you basically need three things to be a fundamentalist. But first, what is a fundamentalist? A fundamentalist is someone who has an extremely narrow cultural field of vision without realizing that that's what they have. That's a fundamentalist. How do you get there? You basically need three things. You need that, the narrow field of vision, like the one-eyed quarterback who's convinced he's going to the Super Bowl. What else do you need? Secondly, you need, guess what? Timeless truth. Now, if such a thing actually existed, it would be perfect if you wanted to become a fundamentalist, because then you would only need one more thing, and that one thing is you would need control. And the way you do that is you basically argue to the rest of the world whom you want to dominate, because remember, you want them to join your field of vision. The way you do that is you claim that you have some kind of special access to that timeless truth. And if you have that, then you can say to people, hey, you better believe this or else. And so you can basically make people subject themselves to your understanding of reality, and there you go. So number 10, literalizing. Christians coming to the text, the biblical text, and when something that a first century person for whom the text was actually written, if we were able to ask that person, should this be interpreted literally, and they would say yes, then Christians have this astonishing habit of turning that into something figurative. And a first century person would look at that and say, what are you doing? This is obviously literal. Now, if you ask that first century person, do you think this piece of the text is literal or figurative? And the first century person would say, oh, this is clearly figurative. Then Christians again have this nasty habit of overturning that and going for literal. Literalizing. And that is so astonishing. We end up completely upside down sometimes. Let me show you what I mean. In Mark 13, Jesus talks about the future of Israel, but he's talking about the imminent future. If you read the beginning of the chapter, it's very clear that the disciples are asking him about this generation explicitly. And Jesus says, all right, let's answer that in terms of this generation, that generation at the time, not us now. So the disciples ask him, when will this happen, these things you're saying about Jerusalem? Doesn't God have to defend the city? And this is, by the way, interesting politically, even today, in terms of nationalism, exceptionalism, religious exceptionalism. And Jesus says, no, God will not defend the city. And what is really clear is that he's talking about that time, that generation, first century. So part of what he says here is this. I'll summarize it briefly. He says, there'll be an abomination of desolation. That's a quotation from Daniel. Whenever you have a quotation from the Old Testament, you better go there. There'll be an abomination of desolation. Those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those on the rooftops, when this happens, must not come down, go inside the house, take anything out of the house. Those on the field must not turn back to get the cloak. Woe to those who are pregnant. It's going to be really bad for them with their babies in those days. Pray that it's not going to happen in winter, because there will be unbelievable, unheard of suffering. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. Be careful, I've told you these things ahead of time. All right, so a first century person would clearly interpret this literally. every part of it, for a number of reasons, one of which is that the Old Testament texts that talk about similar things in similar ways clearly refer to literal events. We know that. So when Jesus uses that language, of course he's doing the same thing, because that is what people had to go with, and that what he expected them to use as an interpretive framework. Secondly, Christians who come to a text like this and make it figurative and sort of spiritualize it and make it about the future, thereby again ripping it away from the actual audience at the time that Jesus was actually talking to. They take this entirely literal passage and rip it away from those people, and they make it about us. Whenever we live, like every generation always seems to think it's about them. And that's narcissism, that's not interpretation. So they make it about themselves, they literalize it, and suddenly the text has nothing to do anymore with the first century audience. So you not only refuse to interpret the text when you do that, you also live out your narcissism. You think everything's about you. Further down, in those days, after the suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, the powers in the heavens will be shaken, everyone will see the Son of Man arriving on the clouds with power and glory. This is a text that for a first century person was clearly figurative. We know that because it comes straight from Isaiah 13 and Daniel 7, and in both cases it is clearly metaphorical and or figurative. The difference between them doesn't matter for our purposes right now. It is really obvious. At the time they used this kind of language with reference to things that happened literally, but they didn't happen like this. The language used for those events was apocalyptic language. So this language referred to literal events, but the language itself was not supposed to be interpreted literally. That's very clear. That would have been clear to any first century person. Guess what Christians do with this? This must be about us because, or our future, because we still haven't seen it. It hasn't literally happened yet. Most evangelicals think this is literal. And so they say, it hasn't happened yet. It must be about the future. So now you've not only ripped it away from the first century and completely turned it upside down. Now you say you basically think you can predict the future along this. And a first century person they would pull their hair out if they were able to, witness us do this kind of thing. Here's my point. The first section I read to you is supposed to be interpreted literally, and Christians make it figurative often. And the second section is supposed to not be taken literally, though it is supposed to be taken to refer to literal events, just not events that literally happen like this. And Christians come again and they turn it around. And so now it is supposedly events that are literally like this, but because they haven't happened, they'll be in the future. Do you see what I mean? Both texts are completely turned upside down. It's like evangelicals have a death wish. It's like we have to mess up the Bible at all costs while claiming and proclaiming to the world that it's ever so important to us. So I call it literalizing, the pick and choose fallacy. This example was from Mark 13. And I think it has something to do with the fact that evangelicals are often told that literal interpretations are better interpretations. One of the most random and demonstrably false hermeneutical assumptions out there. Supposedly, when you interpret literally, you're interpreting better, except, of course, when it runs counter to what you want to say. Then suddenly you switch it around. The stuff that's actually literal now ends up being figurative. Hey, I thought I'd ask. Are you looking forward to something more positive, something constructive, where we actually kind of build things back up again? Me too. Let's do that. See you soon.